Welcome to Mayor Brown's Tech Talks podcast. Each podcast is designed to provide insights on legal issues relating to technology transactions and keep you up to date on the latest trends in data, digital, outsourcing, and software by drawing on the perspectives of practitioners who have executed technology transactions around the world. You can subscribe to this series on all major podcasting platforms. We hope you enjoy the program.
In this episode, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, AI, and artificial intelligence licensing. We're going to talk about the issues that arise in AI license agreements for providers and users, including intellectual property ownership and infringement, warranties, and legal compliance. My name is Julian Dibbell, and I'm your host. I am a senior associate in Mayor Brown's Chicago office with a practice focusing on technology transactions. I'm joined today by Rebecca Eisner, partner in our Chicago office, also in the technology transactions practice. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Julian. Great to be here.
All right, well, let's get started. So, the use of artificial intelligence continues to increase in many industries and within various technologies as innovative organizations use AI to realize competitive advantages. But AI licensing presents unique issues and considerations that organizations should address before implementing an AI solution. So just broadly, Rebecca, what are some of the key challenges regarding the use of AI?
Well, Julian, I'm happy to talk about the key challenges, and perhaps before we delve into that, it might help to do a little bit of setup because that framing helps to explain some of the challenges that exist with AI. So generally, when you talk about AI, you're referring to computer software or algorithms that can perform tasks that are normally done by humans. And typically, when you talk about AI, you hear about machine learning, deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning, and you may hear about robotics process automation, RPA. RPA is like bots. You can think of it like bots. Those are pieces of software that perform routine and repetitive tasks through automation. And RPA is slightly different from machine learning. So when we talk about machine learning and AI, it really starts with the algorithm or the computer code. And into this algorithm or computer code, you must load data. And there are, at a very high and somewhat oversimplified level, two ways that we talk about the data that goes into machine learning and training an AI model. So typically, you need to train an AI model to make it useful. And you can train it with labeled data, which means that you're pre-sensitizing the data so that the algorithm will read and interpret the data in a certain way and produce an outcome. Or you can train an AI solution with unlabeled training data. And that means you don't pre-label any of the data, you just put it into the algorithm and see what the algorithm is able to spit out in terms of the output. And for just a quick example, if you were training an algorithm to be able to distinguish cars from trucks, you would take your data set and you would pre-label characteristics that are particular to cars and those particular to trucks. You would then load that into the algorithm and it would train the algorithm to recognize those distinguishing factors. If you were going to use unlabeled training data, you would simply take this unlabeled data, feed it into the AI solution, and the AI solution would hopefully start to recognize correlations and patterns that would enable it to distinguish between cars, trucks, bicycles, motorcycles, etc. And so that training distinction is really important as we think about the components of AI and we talk about licensing and allocating risk.
Okay, so a very different approach to software development, obviously. how then is licensing AI different from traditional licensing of software or technology?
So when you're licensing AI technology, you're going to have many of the same terms and conditions that you would expect to have in, say, a software agreement or a software as a service agreement. However, AI does present some unique licensing issues. And to get to those, you really have to think about the components of the AI solution. So there are roughly 5 of these that I think it's helpful to frame your thinking in a license agreement. The first one is the AI solution itself. This is the tool or the algorithm that will be used, the machine learning, to produce the desired outcome. The second category is the training data. So this is the data set, as we just discussed with the cars and trucks example, that you use to train the AI solution. The third thing is the production data, which can be very different from the training data set. So the production data is when you actually start feeding in the data from the production sources that you have that you want to run through the algorithm. And it tends to be less structured than the training data. The fourth category is the output. So you've fed the data into the AI solution, and now the AI solution is producing results for you. It's producing reports that show you various correlations and patterns and outcomes for you. That's the AI output. And then finally, if your AI solution is one that is capable of evolution, so that while it learns, it is making adjustments and kind of improving itself along the way, perhaps with the assistance of a human and perhaps somewhat on its own. We call that the AI evolutions. And so those are the subtle changes that are made along the way so that the AI solution, in my example, gets better and better and better at recognizing and distinguishing cars from trucks. And then for those 5 components of AI, you then have to think about who's providing the particular component, who will use the particular component, and who's going to own the component. So that's a lot of information, but those are that's the framework that you need to use when you think about licensing AI.
Let me just ask, see if can we put it in the context of your example of an AI that distinguishes between cars and trucks, right? So the AI solution, I guess, then is once it's trained, you send this thing out into the world to try to distinguish between cars and trucks. That's the AI solution, is the program that's ultimately going to distinguish between cars and trucks, right? The
Yes.
training data then would be like you discussed earlier, labeled or unlabeled, but it's you're going to feed this thing pictures of cars and trucks, right? And that's that data. Then production data is you're sending it out in the world, you're feeding it now images of cars and trucks that it's
Yeah, maybe you've got cameras trained on highways.
Okay.
And so that data from those cameras is then the production data that's being fed back into the solution. And you're trying to determine how much car versus truck traffic exists on these highways, for example.
Okay. And then the output is its determination that this is a truck, this is a car. And then finally, distinguishing between training and evolution, there's a kind of different evolution, you call that. This would be after it's been put out into the world and is doing its job, it can continue to learn. Is that sort of it?
Yes, yes. Maybe the solution starts to recognize patterns and correlations that it wasn't presented with during the training phase, and that becomes another factor that it uses to distinguish between cars and trucks. For example, trucks typically have multiple wheels, particular semi-trucks. So maybe it learns that when it's looking at a double wheel situation, that is likely to be a truck and not a car.
Okay. All right. And so a lot of moving parts here. And then on top of that, there's the usual different kinds of formats that we can see software in. It can either be an on-premises solution where the program is actually installed at the user's enterprise, or we're also seeing cloud-based solutions. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So that's why determining not only the components and who will train the AI solution and whose data will you use, but also how the AI solution will be used is all very important in the licensing considerations.
All right, so getting into it then, what are the key issues impacting providers and users entering into AI license agreements?
Sure. So the key issues, and there are many, but really we focus on kind of four major ones when it comes to technology licensing. So it's intellectual property, or what we call IP, ownership and use rights, intellectual property infringement concerns. How do you structure the warranties and specifically performance promises around the AI solution? And then last, but perhaps most important, is legal compliance.
All right, well, let's take those one by one, starting with IP ownership and use rights. How does the AI model affect that?
So this has been a really interesting and challenging area in AI technology licensing, because the US intellectual property laws have not yet caught up to AI. And so while certain aspects of an AI solution or AI components might be protectable under US patent, copyright, or trade secret laws, generally speaking, US intellectual property laws protect human creativity. They don't protect things that are created by machines or animals for that matter. They only protect human creations. And so if you're talking about a solution that's an AI solution that will evolve and train itself after it starts getting good with the data, you have a question about how do you protect those interests in what's being created. And if you're the provider of the AI solution and you're going to license it to people, for example, many platform cloud providers have AI solutions and are making extensive use of AI already. And if they've got static artificial intelligence tools, meaning those aren't evolving and changing, that's great. That's probably, or could quite likely be copyright protectable. But if your AI solution is going to evolve and it's the machine that is finding those patterns and correlations and evolving the solution, now you're getting into a gray area in IP protection. And so the best way to handle that is through contract rights between the two parties, between the licensor of the AI solution and the user or the licensee of the AI solution. And so you want to make sure that your license covers this topic. And we could get into a lot more detail about allocating those rights, but we probably, that's probably best for another session.
All right, so the contractual approach then to allocating IP ownership and use rights is probably going to be the way to do it. I mean, AI just isn't necessarily covered by copyright law, just like the monkey taking the picture doesn't necessarily have a copyright in that photograph. And then there are various other components that you talked about besides the AI solution itself. There's the training data, the production data, the AI output itself, and of course the AI evolutions are a part of that discussion of how the AI is evolving itself.
That's right. And your license should cover the ownership and use rights around each of those individual components. Yep.
Got it. All right, then how do we handle IP infringement provisions in an AI licensing agreement?
So another really challenging and interesting area with AI, because in typical technology contracting, the provider of a solution provides some type of infringement warranty or at least indemnity that covers the user. And so The user knows by using this software or this cloud service, I know that I'm protected if a third party shows up and says, this is infringing my intellectual property rights. And users of AI solutions would probably expect the same thing under an AI license, but it is slightly different because you've got modifications that might be happening to the AI solution. You have to figure out who trains the model. You have to figure out who's providing the production data that will be used with the model. And then ultimately, what are the evolutions that are happening and the outputs that are happening, and will any of those end up infringing a third party's rights? So it's much more complex because of the dynamic nature of AI and the dynamic nature of the data that goes into using an AI solution. When you think about a typical indemnification for a software license, there are usually exceptions that apply, so that if the user is going to modify the software or technology or combine it with other products or services, or if you're using the software or technology beyond the licensed scope, you may not be entitled to get indemnification for an infringement claim. But when you think about that in the context of AI solutions, all of those things are likely to be happening. There will be modifications to the AI solution. There will be combinations with data that might be coming and most likely are coming from the user, not from the provider of the AI solution. And I don't know how you even define scope, because if there are going to be AI evolutions, the scope is going to morph and change over time as the model changes and the AI algorithm improves itself. So all of these typical software licensing concepts really need to be carefully thought through and potentially modified when you're putting those in the context of an AI solution.
Okay, warranties. In our technology agreements, usually one of the key warranties is the performance warranty. Does the technology do what it's supposed to do? How is that going to get complicated in the under the AI model?
Well, so one of the most common warranties, again, in a traditional software and technology licensing agreement is this performance warranty that you're mentioning, Julian. And with AI, it can be problematic to tie a performance warranty to documentation or specifications. I mean, those of us who do technology licensing are used to seeing some type of warranty that software will perform in accordance with the specifications or the documentation. With AI, if you've got an AI solution that's going to be trained, that's going to continue to evolve and change as it ingests more and more production data, I'm not sure how you come up with a description of what the AI solution is going to do on a static basis. And so that presents a challenge for creating a performance warranty. The AI solution itself may actually drift away from the initial documentation or specifications. And so that can reduce the value of a traditional performance warranty over time. So how do we try to solve this issue? Instead of tying a performance warranty to a static set of documentation or specs, you have to think about, why are you using the AI solution in the first place? What is your desired outcome? And so it's better to think about tying a warranty to the outcome that you want to have happen from use of the AI solution versus a set of documentation that attempts to describe how the AI solution works. But even when you are doing outcome-based performance warranties, you have to be incredibly careful. There's a really funny vignette from China that I think is relevant here that shows this point. There was a Chinese traffic monitoring system that used facial recognition technology to identify violators and issue traffic violations. And a prominent executive in China who was not present at the given location was identified and issued a violation. what happened is a bus that was bearing the likeness of that executive had gone through, and the AI program picked up that facial and recognized it and went ahead and issued the violation when in fact the person hadn't been present at the site. Now, if you had created a performance warranty around that AI system that simply said, you are to give me a facial recognition system that accurately correlates images to the most likely human, that performance warranty would be satisfied, but clearly you would not be satisfying that intended real world, practical, desired outcome of that traffic monitoring system. So I use that as a cautionary note when we talk about creating performance warranties that are tied to outcomes, to be very, very careful how you think about the outcome and how you phrase that into a warranty or some type of promise in your license.
All right, so this is a pretty comprehensive list of things companies need to think about as they are going into agreements relating to AI and AI licensing. What can they do more broadly to mitigate risk related to AI?
That's a great question, Julian. So I think companies ought to be thinking about AI with a risk management framework in mind, the same way that they think about a number of other legal compliance areas. And that starts with thinking about how they will use AI and defining principles and implementing policies regarding the ethical use and intended uses of AI within their organization. And there are some best practices they can follow to help try to mitigate these risks, much like other risk mitigation frameworks that you use in other areas, such as security or open source. Some of these best practices would include conducting due diligence on the AI solution to determine if there are any legal or regulatory risk areas that would merit further inquiry. You should talk about allocating responsibility for the legal and regulatory compliance according to the AI components that we talked about earlier in this podcast. And that should be informed by the answers to the essential questions that we talked about above. You can consider developing a policy around artificial intelligence and involve various stakeholders in that policy making process so that you make sure you've had thoughtful consideration about when is it appropriate within your company to use AI and in what contexts. You can implement a risk management framework that includes a system of ongoing monitoring and controls around the use of AI so that as the AI evolves or as your data sets change, someone is watching over those to ensure that you're not drifting away from acceptable outcomes and acceptable uses of the AI solution. And then finally, as part of all that risk management, companies need to consider which parties should obtain third-party consents for the data use due to potential privacy and data security issues. So those are just some recommendations companies can consider as they think about developing their policies around AI use.
Okay, and in terms of thinking more long range about potential issues and risks, putting on your binoculars and looking out a little further towards the horizon, what do you see as the issues that companies need to keep an eye out for that are starting to emerge kind of out there at the brink of what we can foresee?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but when I think about AI and the way that it's transforming our world, it's creating tremendous benefit and tremendous insights without a lot of oversight. So developers are free to innovate, but they're also creating risk with that innovation. And I think that very soon, leading nations are going to think about AI uses collectively, much in the same way that nations are banding together to talk about issues like climate change. And AI is something that will cross borders, and it's going to need to be handled in a consistent manner with a consistent regulatory framework. So implementing global standards around the use of AI, I think, is something that is foreseeable for the future. And I think that individual nations are going to potentially establish laws and regulations that both promote the development of artificial intelligence as well as perhaps regulate its uses. And certainly, nations are going to need to think about, in that regulatory framework, uses that would be considered unethical or immoral, harmful, and other unacceptable uses. I can almost see artificial intelligence taking on the mantle of corporate social responsibility and perhaps becoming one of the elements against which companies are evaluated as investors and other stakeholders look at those companies and decide whether they want to invest in them. One of the things they may look at is this a company that is responsibly using artificial intelligence? So definitely it is a topic that is worthy of general counsel and board level attention at a company to assure that the social norms and what's comfortable and within the mission and values for a particular company, that's all being properly considered as companies begin to adopt and use artificial intelligence. So that's what I think is on the horizon. It certainly makes for interesting days for technology lawyers like us.
Yes, it does. Well, thank you for those insights, Rebecca. If any of you out there have any questions that you felt Rebecca didn't answer, or if you have any other questions about technology and the law, please email us at techtransactions@mayorbrown.com.
We hope you enjoyed this program. You can subscribe on all major podcasting platforms. To learn about other Mayor Brown audio programming, visit mayorbrown.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening.